Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. It's Thursday afternoon, so there should be enough time for everybody to get their questions in. So let's jump in and see what we got for this week. So to start out this week, I wanted to follow up on a discussion from last week about the Arcooda LCD arcade monitor. So it's meant to be something that an arcade owner would swap out for a broken CRT, so that way you don't have to worry about all of the things that go with CRTs, and you could just bolt this in its place. And while all of us, I'm sure, would prefer a CRT, it's just at that point where we're very quickly approaching either you need a full rebuild and you need to continuously work on it, just like a classic car, or you will need to replace it with an LCD. So we're not really going to have much of a choice coming up somewhat soon. So I wanted to look a little bit more into this, and I ended up walking away with more questions than answers. So they kind of skimmed over a couple of very important points. First of all, there's no lag testing done on it, at least in this video, and I can't find any results online. So right off the bat, I don't trust anything unless somebody's tested it with a time sleuth, a Leo Bodnar, splitting the signal with a 240p test sweep between a CRT and this. There's a bunch of different ways to do it that you can get very accurate results, and I didn't see any of that. So right off the bat, I'm going, if this is going into an arcade machine and you're showing Street Fighter, where's your lag test? And the other thing is, how do you get your arcade signals into this? They mentioned something like you could purchase extra boards from them. So let's just assume, which I do not know this. This is an assumption and a guess, so please don't hold this against me if I get it wrong. But let's just assume one of those adapters will allow you to take the RGBS signal coming out of your JAMA connector and interface directly into this. So let's just assume that exists. So that's cool. Now you really do have a drop-in replacement. You don't need the chassis for the CRT. You could just mount this in its place, hook up some power, use that adapter, plug it in, and you're done. If that's the case, and let's even just assume it's got less than a frame of lag, because you can get tons of LCD monitors with far less than a frame of lag these days for decent prices. How's the image scaled? Is it soft scaled like most monitors do? Because in all of my testing, your average TV does a very good job scaling everything, especially if you put it into context of what it's trying to accomplish. And your average PC monitor is terrible at scaling. They're really designed to be used in their native resolution. So does this have nearest neighbor integer scaling, or is it just smearing the image across all those different pixels? And, it showed a couple of cool options, which are fine, but let's just assume that it's like every other panel out there in smooth scaling. Then if that's the case, why would you want to go through something like this when you could just buy any LCD monitor with a VESA mount it in its place? You'd have to get a little creative, but if you're working on arcade machines, you're probably already creative with this stuff anyway. And then just get like a GBS control and connect it that way. Wouldn't it be the same exact amount of money for all you're really paying for on this is some mounting controls? I don't really know. I have so many more questions about it. Because on the flip side, if it is doing an integer scale and it is able to accept higher voltage arcade boards even with an adapter board, then everybody should know about this. But if it's not, then why would you want this over something else? So that's an honest question. I'm not, I'm not just kind of pontificating about this. I'd love to know if I'm missing something, but I asked questions in the chat or in the comments of this video. No one ever answered, but I can't see myself ever using this one unless a few other things are clarified. So, I just wanted to follow up because I wanted to answer this way last week, but I wanted to at least give the company time to respond to the comment. But it's kind of interesting to see. It's just not something I think I would recommend, but I want to be wrong about this one. So please let me know if you bought one of these, if you're using it, if I got something wrong. I hope I did. I hope this thing's awesome, and I hope it's an easy drop-in replacement, but my gut's telling me no, definitely not. Over on Patreon, a couple of questions from Shurzhur. First, they wanted to clarify last week that they did mean routing all of their different systems, both newer and older, on the PVM through the GBSC. So yeah, I think my answer could have been a little bit more to the point and streamlined, but basically yes, you could use that to downscale newer consoles to 15 kilohertz and upscale older consoles that are coming out of that into a flat panel or a capture card or whatever else, or use it in pass-through mode or whatever else you want to use. You would just have to have different, either 2 GBSs or just have a way to switch things around pretty easily. But yeah, that should be totally it. And those things are cheap and easy to build. Next, though, they want to know if I know anything about the Extron MTP series. They use UTP connectors and cables with special transmitters and receivers for distributing RGB HV and other signals over longer distances. The matrix switchers for those are cheaper than the crosspoint HVAs. Would these be suitable for gaming? So I've never used them, but you would want to check 2 things. First, does it buffer anything and add latency? That's always the first thing, which is easy to check. And then second, does it compress the image at all? Because there absolutely are ways to do very long runs of video with 0 latency, but you have to specifically look for that. Because if you just want to distribute video across a Best Buy or something like that, then, you know, a couple of frames of latency means nothing, especially if all the TVs that you're showing are all equal in latency, then it all just looks like it's synced up. So you would really need to test it or ask somebody else who's tested it. That test pattern I always use that Fudo was nice enough to host on his website, the Extron test pattern, that's a great way to test if colors are getting compressed. And of course, any of the methods of testing lag will work as well. So you would have to really look into that. But if anybody has any suggestions or has any experience, please let us know. Carlos Moreau wants some pointers for getting surround sound out of N64, GameCube, and PlayStation 2. While with their PlayStation 4 and up, they're hoping they can get surround sound through HDMI into the AV receiver, but they don't know if their setup can do surround on older consoles. Can you point me in the right direction, or are the surround sound these older consoles have unavailable to new receivers? Carlos, you have impeccable timing. I literally am in the middle of a post that is testing exactly this. And in fact, if your post wasn't 7 days ago, I'd be looking over my shoulder wondering if you were creeping in on me here. But it's an excellent question, and it's one I'm in the middle of solving. So there's a few things to note. First, any older surround formats like ProLogic and ProLogic 2 encode surround information in just left and right audio. So there's nothing to do on your console, on the cables, or anything else. It's only on the receiver side. The only thing you might want to do is if your game has settings to enable surround, hit enable, but that's basically it. And on the receiver side, that's where things get complicated, because modern receivers should be able to decode older ProLogic stuff. However, what mode do you put it in? What mode sounds better? What mode sounds better per game? And that's what I'm trying to solve. So hopefully, if all goes right, by this weekend, we should have, at the very least, released earlier for subscribers, but hopefully to the public too, I'll have a post ready that lets you play some test files through your surround sound setup. And you could just anything that you have connected to it should work that could output stereo audio, because the surround channels, since they're encoded in, that's it. So if you have the ability to play a music file in stereo, which you totally could with your PlayStation 3, you should be able to just put it into your stereo and hit different modes. And that's one of the final testings I got to do before I complete the post and everything, and make sure that the test files aren't copyrighted. I got to double check that. I think that's one of those gray areas where it kind of isn't, but I maybe shouldn't use them, but it's not taking money away from anybody, so I'm going to try to do it anyway. But basically play those through your receiver and cycle through the different modes. And the receiver I have has a bunch of fancy sounding modes and also one labeled Dolby Surround. So that one worked, but a couple other modes worked as well. So I need to make a notation of which ones definitely do. And that way when I'm playing an older game with ProLogic Surround, I could switch between the multiple modes that do work properly and see what sounds best for me. Because it's kind of interesting. The receiver I have has the ability to do a full analog bypass for all analog inputs. So if I'm playing, let's just say Star Fox on Super Nintendo in analog bypass mode, I don't get digital surround processing, but it sounds awesome. It sounds like a really high quality, totally analog amp. And then if I flip it into Dolby Surround mode, it does do some digital processing, so it doesn't sound as good, but then I get the surround channels. And it's really up to you to decide which one you prefer. There's no right or wrong way, but what's the easiest way to test that? That's what I'm working on, being able to just play these files. So the short version is, what you need is just to plug it in, but how do you know it's working? And that's where these test files come into play. Same thing with any HDMI devices. Your receiver should be able to detect everything. If you have just a 2-channel but Adobe Pro Logic system going through HDMI, it should be the same on your receiver. Your receiver is just going to see that same signal that needs to be decoded just digitally instead of analog. And in fact, the captures that I've been taking for these are all through digital audio to try and keep the original audio samples as pure as possible. So you should really have to do nothing. I guess the short answer to your question 5 minutes later is you should just have to press a button on your receiver, but what button and what setting is what this aims to solve. So if you have any questions, or if I didn't answer that right, now is the time to please speak up, because I'll get that into the post and get it out, I'm hoping by next week, but maybe the week after. So if I got that wrong, let me know and I'll try to word it better for people. Gemini Man wants to know if it's possible to mod an SNES Mini to fit into a classic SNES shell. They're nostalgic for the classic shell, but want to keep the beautiful output of the one-chip Mini. No, the mounting holes won't match up. The ports won't match up. You could probably get creative and cut and re-drill, but it's way too much work, and it would be way less work just to find a one-chip SNES. So you could find that by the serial number, by opening them up. I never fully trust the serial number because I know tons of people over the years who have 2 consoles, a mint condition one that doesn't work anymore and a yellowed, cracked, broken one that works perfect, and they just do a case swap. So there's nothing wrong with that, but that's one of the many reasons why you can't only go by the serial number. But if you just do that, you don't need to mod it at all. All you would need to do is find a one-chip and it looks great. If you wanted to do a bypass, you can get it a tiny bit better, but really it's not necessary as far as video quality from non-one chip to one chips go. Now, there are mod boards being worked on for the non-one chips, and they range in difficulty and accuracy and performance. So there are ones, the one project that should definitely work is ones that require you to take the chips off the board, put it on a new board, and mount that all in its place. And that will absolutely look stunning, but that's a ton of work, and the project's kind of on hold because of the part shortage. There's a few other ones out there that are not as hard to do, but they don't always work right. They don't always look right, and it could not just vary based on console, but based on the game that you're playing. So I don't recommend those unless you're already a tinkerer. You're somebody that won't mind redoing a mod 4 or 5 times and buying 4 or 5 boards before everybody gets it right. However, there is one coming out that gets it supposedly like 75% of the way to what a one chip looks like. So it's not going to look as good, but it's going to look infinitely better than regular, and it'll work on all of them and on all games. And that's the one that I'm kind of waiting on, because I think for most people that would be more than enough, and relatively easy mod. If you've never done a mod before, I'm sure it's hard. If you've done a bunch of mods before, this is going to be super easy, but I think that's the one that I'm kind of waiting on. Now, of course, I'm not naming any of these, and I'm not talking about them on the weekly podcast because none of them are finished, and I haven't tested that last one yet. So, and that's not an insult to any of the devs too, by the way, but anybody working on projects, you have the set of test criteria that's available to you, and that's it. So you could spend 1,000 hours testing something, send it to another person who plugs it into one thing and it doesn't work. So that's why I'm always very careful about this. I don't want to put pressure on devs. I don't want to pre-announce products that aren't even done yet. And I certainly don't want to make it sound like, I'm talking down about any of these projects. I just want to verify that they're in the right state. So probably a longer answer than you wanted, but I wanted to make sure I was clear about this because I do often get SNES questions like it. And I'll leave a link to the page on the website. But honestly, if sharpness is really important to you, find a one chip, and you don't really need to do anything else ever. So I'll leave a link to that one for you. Matt Richtenberg said they received their Kickstarted 4K Gamer Pro, and they love the way it makes Switch games look when they're 3D. Have I heard about any updates about the company adding a straight 1080p to 4K integer scaling mode for 2D games? No, and I think that's going to be a definite no, because I think maybe they looked into it and they realized it would be a lot of work and a total code redesign in order to do it, when this is really already the product that they intended to make. Now, I completely disagree in the fact that they probably would open themselves up to a much wider market if they had a true integer scaling mode, because then everybody with a RetroTink 5X and OSSC and anything that could output 1080p would be fine, and I think that would be perfect. Except, they've already done it. They've already sold enough. There's no motivation to them to do it because the Kickstarter got funded. So I don't blame them for it. I'm not mad at them for it. It's not what I would do, but I completely understand why they did it this way. And, it's one of those things where if they heard about the retro gaming use before they launched the Kickstarter, they probably could have put the project on hold for a few months and figured it out. But, I mean, are you really going to delay shipping a product that people have paid a lot of money for just to add a feature that may or may not be a selling point? So I get it. No disrespect to that team whatsoever, but just I think it's a safe bet that we're never going to get true integer scaling from them. Perkin Warbeck said they recently picked up a 7501 model PlayStation at a thrift store. They were touring with the idea of putting an ODE of some kind, and since the X Station isn't compatible and they have a working laser, PSIO seems like a natural choice. However, they started researching about it, and there seems to be a lot of negativity out there surrounding its software support or lack thereof. They don't want to spend that kind of money on something only a little less janky than something like Pop Starter on their PS2. Do they think there's much hope of a big software update down the road, or is pretty much what you see is what you get? I know nothing about the development team. I have no inside knowledge about this whatsoever, and my honest, cut and dry, drama-free answer is I would expect nothing. And I mean that both based on the output of firmware updates and also just, I think that's a really good way to approach products that you're hoping for features on, but they aren't there yet. I would always buy something like that, hoping for nothing and just assuming it is exactly as it is. And then if you get updates afterwards, it's a good surprise. But what I would suggest is looking into cheaper used ones. If you're in the US, I think I know at least one person selling one now, so just message me directly and I can try to put you in touch, because you save a lot of money. And the only thing that I would suggest is making sure that you know the person you're buying it from. And by know the person, it's a friend of a friend. It's a real person. It's not a random eBay seller. And I'm not saying that to talk badly about eBay. I'm saying that because it requires you to transfer your license, because they're one of the many companies that couldn't figure out how to do security the right way, so they make you register each individual device, which means transferring it to get future firmware updates could be a nightmare if it hasn't been properly transferred in your name. So that would be the only hesitation about that. As far as comparing it to Pop Starter, everybody seems to agree that it's better, but it's not as robust as the X Station, but maybe someday well, I shouldn't say that. Some games run exactly like the original disc, but the amount of games that do, I don't think is as much as the X Station. So that's certainly something to consider. But picking up a used one from somebody where like even if you can't get it transferred, if a new firmware comes out, you could just email them and say, hey, sorry to bug you, can you send me the new file for this? I think that's probably a great way to get that in on a much cheaper angle. And just hopefully at some point we could get different adapters for things like the X Station that'll make it more compatible with more different models of PlayStation. Triple Fault said, in a recent stream I mentioned not wanting to cut the tabs on an SNES cartridge tray to make it region free, and they're in the same camp. Do I know if there's a 3D printable tray for the SNES Mini that's available for folks to print at home? They haven't been able to find one, and the one linked on the SNES tips page is currently over 55. So like anyone else with a 3D printer, they're always looking for an excuse to print something and would prefer that over buying. So a few things, Triple Fault. First of all, I know that I'm kind of crazy for having that opinion. I'm not calling you crazy, but cutting tabs on the inside of a cartridge tray, no one's ever going to see. But it bothers me, and it's my console, so if anybody wants to make fun of me, go right ahead. It's my console, I'm not cutting those tabs. As dumb as it is, I want to have that original cartridge tray sitting in a box somewhere in case I ever feel the need to put it back. I cannot ever imagine a scenario in which I would want to, other than to show in a video the difference But that's just, I'm weird and I'm all right with that. So if you're a fellow weirdo like me that refuses to cut plastic when you don't need to, then I would look around, because I've heard of a couple of different people posting designs like this, but I wasn't sure if they'd been tested, if they fit right. So I would just keep looking. And if anybody out there does 3D printed designs and they want to model their own version of this, that would be cool as well. It's not, and that's kind of a weird gray area, right? Because what I just said implies that somebody should make something to undercut the person selling something. But, with designs like this, it's kind of cool to have both. And while I completely understand that people want to get paid for their time, I do think the scenario of releasing the files after, a certain amount of sales are out there are pretty good, because that way people that don't have 3D printers can pay you, and people that do have 3D printers can just print one and then maybe even help, maybe learn from the design, give some feedback. Hey, I used this type of plastic and it didn't fit right, so I used this type and it fits perfect, so maybe leave those notes. Or so I don't know. But the bottom line is, this is a part for a console that's been out for 30 years. So if somebody else puts out a free version, that's not cloning or stealing. It's just a different way of going about the same thing. So hopefully it's out there. And if you find a link, please let me know, and I'll add that alongside the other link that I currently have there. A couple of questions from Adam Ant. First, they saw that Todd from RetroFrog has the Neo Geo to USB controller converter, and they were looking for the opposite, a USB to Neo Geo, specifically for the Neo Geo Mini controllers. Does anyone make this? Sort of. So the Undammed adapters are USB to DB15. Ashton has one out, the Axunworks one, and there's also at least one open source design that I've tested. I'm so sorry, Ralph, I forgot the name of the product, but I'll try to leave a link to that just to make up for my forgetfulness here. So you could use all of those, but what I'm not sure about is, will it work on a Neo Geo? Because the pinout of an average supergun is close to Neo Geo, but some don't always work. So I would look into all of these different types of adapters, look at the specs, and maybe even just message them and ask, will this work on an original Neo Geo with the Neo Geo Mini USB controller, and kind of cross your fingers. Also, second question, they loved the conversation with the lawyer about cloning, and in my opinion, where do I think the line is between reverse engineering and cloning? Is it just likeness and being deceptive about who manufactured it? So there is no easy answer to that. There's, the legal line is reverse engineering is you copy a product based on you learning with only whatever the product that's on the market is and nothing else. And cloning would be you dumped some of the security off the chips and the code off of it, and that way you just copied the code to your new one, or you stole their design, or you hired the same manufacturer that makes them to just spin off a couple extras and slap your logo on it. So legally, that's where that is. But morally, I think it's I just think there's so much gray area, and I was really hoping for a good conversation about this, but the only people that seemed to comment that disagreed with my stance in that video were trolls that probably, just looking for attention, maybe even works for one of these clone companies. Kaiko's come after me a lot with, I'm pretty sure, more than one account, so could have been them on a bunch of it. But this is the type of gray area conversation that I really enjoy having, because I don't think there is a right answer, but I could certainly give some examples about it, right? So somebody comes out with a product today, and 4 or 5 years from now, somebody figures out how they did it, put their own spin on it, and releases it. It's not cloning legally, and it's been a couple of years since the original person had released it, so it's a competitor in the scene. But I think while you might be the original person who made it, they might be a little pissed, but I don't think that's cloning. I think that's just progress and making similar things. But, I post a design for my new water glass up on Twitter, and, pre-orders are open now. I have the prototypes working perfect. I'm just putting a run for production in, and Bitfunks sees that and zooms in on the picture and makes the exact same water glass I have and says, don't worry about pre-orders, I got them now, and they're 1/10 of the price because they're shitty quality and probably won't work in a while, start to leak your water out of the glass. That isn't technically cloning. It's not legally cloning. They just made what you made from a picture, and as long as they didn't clone your logos, whatever, but it's really shitty. And I think there's a lot of gray area in between to talk about that. And you absolutely could take the stance of, if it's not illegal, screw it, I'm going to do it. But the problem is, two things happen when you do that. First of all, you alienate everybody around you, because it might take a little while, like it took a little while to figure out who Bitfunks was, but eventually everybody is just going to say, even if I don't care about cloning, if I talk to you, nobody else is going to talk to you. This is just, I don't want to have to deal with this. And on the flip side, you might be able to get a little farther in the short term, which is, I think, why companies like this do it. I think they realize, look at how much money we saved in development. Let me put out these 20 products, and then all of a sudden they're going to start to get slapped with lawsuits now that we're helping to get the info out there on how to do something like that. And I think very quickly they're going to realize it was a bad mistake. So what I would love to have is a more open discourse about the gray area, and morally speaking, when is it right and not right to do it. And of course, there's always parallel thinking. I've told the story many times about how Cousin Scott and I designed Bordy's SNES RGB amp. It was square, not that cool shape, and it was with through-hole components, but we basically both took the data sheet of the 7314 and kind of worked out how the signal would go. And then I saw Bordy's, and my heart sank, because this was so much better. It was, it was surface mount components, not through hole. It was smaller. So I just emailed him and said, hey, I had the same design, but yours is better. So, do you plan on selling this? What do you think? And he was like, no, it's open source. Do what you want with it. So that was a really good story about it, because he could very easily have turned around and be like, no, this is my design. I did this first. Here's mine from 3 years ago. You must have seen my post on a forum and stole it. And he wouldn't have been wrong to do that, but it was just really cool working with him, because there is a lot of parallel thinking. There's no way that two nerds with somewhat similar experience wouldn't look at a problem and come up with a similar solution. So that's not cloning. Sometimes that's just really unfortunately timed. I don't blame anybody who does that, but there's certainly been people who have both been working on a product, both release it at about the same time, and they butt heads. Now, of course, there's a bunch of cloners. One notorious one who's done shit like that for years, where they would literally go into somebody's Discord, have a conversation with them about that product, and then post on their website, here's my new whatever cable for this thing, and it's exactly what the other person was working on. And then they go, oh, but I've had this design for years. So, it's one of those funny things. But I wanted to talk a little bit more openly about it, because I feel like these Q&As are kind of laid back, or at least I hope that they are, and not so much on the weekly podcast, because I talked a little bit through stuff like this on the podcast last week, and then woke up Wednesday morning and went, that just adds a bunch of negativity, and it's not the place. So I cut it all out. That's why if you see that awkward cut at the end, that's what that was. So I wanted to share a couple more thoughts here. If this was the wrong place to do it, please let me know, because I always want to do whatever you all want to do. And of course, the politer that you let me know these things, the more I'm going to listen. If you're like, hey, dummy, why don't you stop word vomiting and move on? I might listen, or I might just call you an ass and I don't know, say something bad, but not you, Adam. Thank you for the question, and hopefully I added some perspective, and I'll get you a link to that Neo Geo, or the USB to Neo Geo style controller adapters. Seacon wants to get some light gun games working on their arcade cab that has a 15 kHz CRT in it. Are there any good light gun implementations for the Mister yet? It also have a PC that outputs 15 kHz connected to the cabinet, so emulation is an option. Is it worth picking up a pair of GunCon 1 or 2s at this point? So I had not had good luck with the GunCon and the Mister, but I wasn't sure if I was doing something wrong. I thought I had everything updated. I thought I checked all the settings, but when I did that at the end of that live stream a while back, I couldn't really get anything working. So I think that's something you might want to ask in the Mr. Discord or on their forums or something else. What's the status now? And because that does seem like a really awesome option for Mr. There's, of course, always like the Sinden Lightguns and stuff like that. And I believe for MAME, there's also a USB Lightgun that would work. I'm not sure if they're pretty expensive. They're over $100, but that's something to think about. But I don't know about GunCons and PC with MAME or anything like that. I've never tried it. So unfortunately, I'm going to be completely useless to you at this point and just have to point you in other directions. But these are things that I would really love to go back and test because I love light gun games, and I would love to find some reliable light guns, third party and original, whatever, that I could just plug into my Mister and use, because I think it would be even more fun than using the originals, because while I always prefer using the original controllers, I think having a light gun that just works, I don't have to worry about old technology and inaccurate guns and stuff like that. Having a light gun that I could just plug in and use would be amazing. That would be one I would definitely pay. If that over $100 one works perfect, I would totally pay for that one. So I think it's something that we need to do a little more research on, but hopefully there's a good solution. Jason Guffey is looking for some explanation as to what the video signal 540p is. And I am not an expert at this, but I think I know enough to be able to explain it pretty clearly. And if I get it wrong, feel free to make fun of me in the comments and post links to or at least post the info that I missed. But I think the best way to visualize this is in the context of HD CRTs. I'm not sure if that's the origin of 540p, but I would be willing to bet it very well could be, at least, because if you think about CRTs in resolution, they don't really care what the resolution is, they care what the frequency is, which is why to a CRT, 240p and 480i are the same thing. They don't care. It's the same frequency, 15 kilohertz, nothing else matters to that CRT. And I think what happened was when HD CRTs came out, they ran at a frequency that could be either 540p or 1080i, and everything was scaled to that because it was cheaper to put a scaler in than it would be to put a multi-format power supply and all the windings for the tube itself. And that's pretty complicated. I talked about that in I think the interview with Thomas was probably the most detailed that we got into, but the best way to describe it is if you've ever been around a multi-format CRT and you go from 15 kilohertz to 31, there's a whole lot of pops and clicks, and the 15 kilohertz wind disappears. Whereas if you go to any of these HD CRTs, you switch through every resolution that it supports, and there's zero sound coming out of it. There's no 15 kilohertz whine, there's no pops. It's just having everything scaled to it. And I think that's why you might find scalers from that era, like the DVDO VP50, that, remember, it was a really expensive scaler. So that was probably a way for DVDO to say, hey, this is the resolution this thing actually runs at, or frequency. So use our very expensive scaler to get all your content to that. And then, skip the TV's cheap built-in scaler, which makes sense. And that's exactly why you see it on the RetroTink 5X. And there's another version of that coming out in a different scaler I should be testing soon. But the purpose would be to run these HD CRTs at their native frequency. So 540p, 1080i should be the same. I could be wrong about that, but I feel like that's a good guess. And that would skip all the onboard processing and allow for reduced lag, better images, and stuff like that. So I think that is the basic overview of 540p. If anybody has any thoughts on this, or if I get anything wrong, please let me know. But that's certainly how I've been kind of looking at it. And I did discuss this a bit with Shank in the last interview we did on the Retro World Roundup podcast. And I'm going to be following up with that as well. I know one person who lives somewhat close to me that has one of these TVs, and I shot a bunch of footage, and I wasn't really sure what to do with the footage. And now that Shank told me that there was this mode in the service menu, I think I'm just going to go back, reshoot footage, like we'll call it the before and after footage, if you will, and kind of put it all together, just explaining exactly what you asked in a fancy 10-minute video with a bunch of cool B-roll that shows that those HD CRTs do definitely have some uses to them. I will say, though, plugging 240p directly into that HD CRT that scales it looked terrible, added a bunch of lag. 480i looked awesome, and 480p looked awesome. So you don't need to go to 540p to get a really good experience. And don't forget, 2 frames of latency on a CRT with no motion blur and no other additional variable lag is definitely different than 2 frames of latency on an LCD panel, let's just say. So you don't need to go to 540p, but I'm really interested to see what the difference is going to be. So it might take a while to get that video out, but I hope to do it at some point. And it's just about balancing, making sure the weekly stuff doesn't suffer, and crossing my fingers that a video that took 30 hours to make isn't going to only get 1,000 views or something. So I'll try to get to it. The importer wants to know what current or upcoming device or combination of devices would allow them to upscale their consoles like the Wii, GameCube, PS3, and Switch to 4K, and possibly help remove jagged edges. So there are 2 answers to this question. The removing jagged edges part is adding some anti-aliasing like the M cable tries to do and fails most of the time. And that is kind of a unique feature that only really it offers at the moment. The RetroTink 5X does have a cool smoothing filter, but it's designed for different things. So, and also, do you need to go to 4K? Or do you just need to get to a spot where you're not going to see a huge difference? So right now, today, if you wanted to take those consoles and add some smoothing to them, I would find any way to get those consoles into the M cable or M Classic or whatever, and set it to smoothing mode and kind of go from there. PS3 and Switch offer HDMI output, so that's easy. GameCube, you could use a Carby. The Wii, you'd have to use some kind of analog to digital converter, but those are pretty cheap, including the one from Consoles for You is selling now. That's a good quality one. It's not cheap, but that'll handle quite a bunch of different things. So that should help. I don't think the M cable or M Classic does a great job with 480p. I honestly think it does a very good job with 720p and sometimes for 1080, but then it all depends on your TV from there, because if your TV is able to accept a higher, like a 1440p signal, or if it scales that 1080p signal the way that you like it, then that might be all you need for smoothing. But the real solution to this would be a device that accepts all inputs from HDMI all the way down to composite video, or I guess even RF, but something that takes all inputs, outputs 4K, and allows you to choose sharp scale, soft scale, combination, maybe an anti-aliasing filter like the M Classic M cable does. That would be the ideal device for something like this. And it's not out yet, doesn't exist. The RetroTink 4K, which is still very early on in development, and we might not see it for 2 years based on the part shortage, and that is not an insult to Mike, that's just reality, unfortunately. That has the potential to do all of that, because it will accept all those, it'll scale it to 4K, and Mike definitely has smooth and sharp scaling options already programmed into the RetroTink 5X, but how smooth will it be? So adding smoothing onto that is kind of the question here or is the part of the question that's the hardest to answer. So I guess if you wanted a short version, right now take all of those consoles, get them to HDMI and get them into the M Classic, cross your fingers and hope they look okay. You could try to do something like send all of those into the RetroTink or something like that, or the Tink 5X, set that to 720 or 1080, and then let the M cable smoothing handle it after that. You could certainly try that, but if you're looking for smoothing, it would definitely be the M cable at the moment. If you're just looking to get them all the way to 4K, there's a couple of other things you could look at, but really it's going to be hard to get it that last bit to 4K. You could try the RetroTink 5X, try its 1440p mode, use its soft scaling, and then hope your TV scales it the rest of the way for soft scaling. But both of those are the only 2 options today that I could think of that would be able to do that, to actually add a smoothing or softness to it. And, just keep your eyes open for anything in the future. Obviously, we'll make a big deal about it whenever anything like this does come out. But for the short term, probably just start with an M Classic for smoothing, or grab a RetroTink 5X for most of the rest of those. The Switch, you would have to go... The Switch would be the only thing because it doesn't have an analog output. But depending on your use case, that's kind of up to you on that one. Well, hey, look at that. I made it all the way through a Q&A without screwing up the audio. Anyway, that's it for this time. Thank you all very much for participating in these. If you have any questions at all, wherever it is that you support, please ask your question there in the latest Q&A post. Because the way these services work, I can't figure out what's a new question on an older post. Plus, I really just like scrolling through in real time and trying to do these very laid back as if we were all kind of sitting here hanging out with each other. So whatever question you have, just ask wherever it is you post in the latest Q&A post. And if you're not a supporter yet, you could do so in many different ways. Monthly support services are what keep all of this going, but a giant help is just clicking through affiliate links, including buying the exact same stuff you were going to buy anyway for the same exact price, but then just going over to RetroRGB.com/support, clicking on the Amazon or eBay link, and then checking out for the same exact price. That also helps keep this stuff afloat as well. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next week.